Welcome, fellow collectors and challengers of quality cardboard nostalgia. I am your host, the Lorcanist, and today we're going to be talking about what we don't know about Lorcana. A lot of content creators are talking about what we do. To be honest, there's not a whole lot. So, what I wanted to go through is a lot of the things that we don't know and how that may or may not shape up and how that could impact the game as a whole. Starting off, gameplay. We don't have any rules. So all we are so far been able to do is glean a little bit from the cards that have been released so far and this lovely little set of names for our resources, which is called ink. Now, this beautiful little image here with Elsa has been put together by the fine people at Lorcana HQ. Definitely go check them out for your Lorcana information. They're going to be a phenomenal resource going forward. As you can see on the card, we have some sort of resource cost in ink. We have some sort of attack slash defense stat. Um, our name of our card, the version, some keywords here, which they have labeled as subtypes. This is where our abilities go, and our flavor text. We don't know what this lovely little symbol here means. There's a lot of people saying that could be lore and could be tied to how we actually win the game. Some people are saying it's a rarity. Nobody really knows. But it could shape up to be a pretty interesting mechanic if it is something other than simply rarity. As far as these colors go, we've got some color theory going on as well as some gym theory people have been talking about. All in all, we don't really know what they mean until we get a better idea of, the color wheel as it applies to Lorcana and what each of these, colors represent and what they're good at, what they're bad at. We're not really going to have a know. And that's going to take more cards to be released before we can really figure that out. Now, as far as these color situations, so there's a couple things that they could go into that we don't know about, and it's going to be pretty important. So, one could be a deck building mechanic. So it could be something along the lines of Commander or some other games, like Universus, where you pick a certain symbol or a certain color, and that's what your deck's limited to. And so it could be that we're only limited to Emerald cards or we're only limited to Amber cards. I don't think that's particularly likely, but it is a possibility. Now, the other option that seems to be the most likely situation is that these are going to have something to do with our resource generation, which is going to be a soft limit on how we can build our decks. Just like with lands and magic, building, multiple color decks is difficult because you're managing those resources. Now, how these resources are implemented, we're not really sure. We know it's called ink. There's a popular theory going around called the ink pot theory, where basically you have a deck of 15 cards and they're your ink cards, and the first player starts off with draws one. Then after that, every turn the player draws two, and that becomes your resources. There's been some videos about, mathematically whether this resource system makes sense, and it seems to. And it's pretty popular. I think it's a pretty cool system. I would like it. I like similar systems in games like Runeterra. I'm not really a Hearthstone person, but I like the consistent generation of resources so that what your curve is, and there's not as much RNG to it. It would also open up some pretty interesting options for, say, maybe legendary ink pots that are two colors, or legendary ink pots where you can only have one in your ink pot deck, and whenever you commit it in order to generate a resource, it also gives some sort of effect, like it gives your creature haste for the turn, or that creature comes in with a +1/+1, or something to that effect, which would be pretty cool. Yeah, so without understanding, these deck building limitations, as well as, exactly how we generate our resources, it's hard to really determine, what is going to be a good card or a bad card, or how we can go about building our decks in general. So until we have more information about that, everybody's just kind of shooting things in the wind. Everybody's got their own ideas about what the game's going to look like, what makes sense to them. So we'll see what it looks like going forward. Over on to some more really important gameplay things that we don't know about. One, the turn structure. So, is the game going to be, similar to Magic, where you've got, a ready phase, then, a main phase where, you play all your stuff, and then there's a separate combat phase. And then after that, there's another main phase, and then, you in your turn. That has implications that, if you don't have a second main phase, then certain cards are going to be more valuable in certain situations. So, say, for example, I'll talk about this more with Cruella de Vil because a lot of these things really impact how valuable that card is. If you only have one main phase and combat phase and then your game's over, it makes it stronger. If your opponent has an opportunity to play things after the fact, then it makes the bouncing ability weaker. Uh, Other things of that nature. Could it be something similar to Digimon, where basically there is no phases, essentially? You just have your turn and you do things in whatever order you want to do them, as long as you have resources to play and things to do. So that would be a different situation as well because it's less structured, it gives you more freeform, and it also, allows certain abilities to be stronger than others depending on that situation. So there's a lot of different ways that the turn structure could go that is going to end up impacting the gameplay overall and how cards are going to play on the table. On top of that is challenging or combat. We don't know how that's going to work. People are making, ideas or assumptions or, hopes and dreams or whatever it is about, how the combat system is going to work in Lorcana. And so we do know that there's going to be, some creature on creature combat or character on character combat in this case. And that's going to be called challenging. And should someone lose a challenge, then they get banished. We don't know exactly what that means. We don't know if that means it goes to the graveyard. We don't know if it is removed from game. We don't know if there's going to be graveyard interacting mechanics in Lorcana. So we don't know if being removed from play or going to the graveyard or even any different from each other. If there's going to be any other ways of interacting with things out of play. So these are some things, but one of the big ones is when it comes to challenging. Is it a situation where you issue a challenge to the opposing player and then they choose how to react? So if they choose, you challenge with your Elsa here, since she's on the screen, and then they choose to block with a Robin Hood, then you kind of lose out. Your Elsa's going to die, and there's not really a whole lot you can do about that. But there's some other people that think that the attacker is going to be choosing who they attack. There could be some stipulations around that. So that's kind of how Digimon works, for example. But in order to attack an opposing Digimon, the Digimon has to be tapped or exerted, as it would be phrased in Lorcana. So that could be another situation: is what are the stipulations for challenging? How do you challenge different characters, and who gets to determine what characters are challenging each other? And so these are all really important uh, considerations for when we're reviewing these cards and looking at it and the gameplay in general and what the game's going to feel like, how it's going to play, what's going to be valuable, what's going to be not. Because in each of these situations, a card like Cruella de Vil or a card like Captain Hook that gains bonus power is what I'm going to be calling it whenever he attacks or challenges is going to be variable depending on exactly how that system plays out. So these are things we don't know. There are things that we have to take in consideration when we're looking at these cards. Some other important things to consider is that we know absolutely nothing about non character cards. The only cards we've seen so far are characters. So we don't know if there are non character permanents, such as trainers in Digimon, or enchantments, or artifacts in Magic. I'm really not familiar with Pokemon, and it's been 20 years since I've even looked at Yu-Gi-Oh. So apologies to my Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh people. Runeterra doesn't have a lot of non-character permanents, but there are a couple, and they can be important in the right deck. And then what shape does non-character permanents take? So are they, global enchantments? Are global artifacts or attached cards? Like equipment or enchantments that attach onto a character in Magic. These are different considerations, and that's going to change up the gameplay. And they can be huge. If you're able to permanently give your Captain Hook first strike through some sort of enchantment or equipment, then that's huge. Because when he challenges, he gets that +2 and he'll deal damage before the other opponent. Like, that's a huge buff to, a character like Captain Hook. Whereas if these things aren't present in the game, or they aren't common, or they aren't powerful, or efficient, then that could be a major consideration as well. On top of that, we have no idea about non permanents. So, spells. What the, are there going to be different speeds of spells? Are there going to be instants? Are there going to be sorceries? Things that you can only play on your turn, things that you can play on both people's turns, things that are going to, with say, flash that can outspeed anything else, and go on the stack and resolve before anything else, or things that you know you can't interact with. Then these are going to be important considerations as well, because once again, Captain Hook, if you're challenging and then your opponent picks something that thinks is going to survive, and then suddenly you drop a instant spell that gives him +1 power and first strike, and suddenly your thing that was going to survive now dies. You can be pretty surprised, and those that can have huge impacts on the game. So these are things we know nothing about, or what impact they're going to have on the gameplay as a whole. And that goes into resource generation as well. If these aren't super important, or if they don't even exist in the game, which would be kind of weird, but could be possible, then saving resources won't be really important. So your goal is going to be to try to as efficiently dump as many resources as you can onto the board, and just build up your board as quickly as possible. But if spells, non-permanents, are a big factor of the game, then that adds a more dynamic to the resources. Is how many resources do you save? And you look at your opponent and say, okay, how many resources does he have? What colors are he playing, or what colors does he have available to him? So what can I expect? Like, all these different things are going to drastically affect the gameplay, and we know nothing about them at all. So I'm really looking forward to all of these additional things, and seeing what shape the game takes overall. There was something else about combat that I was just thinking about that oh, that's it. How, what qualifies as a character getting banished? So is it, do they have essentially regeneration? So say one Elsa attacks another Elsa, they deal 2 damage to each other. Neither of them dies because they have 3 defense or 3 health. Well, does that damage go through, and then a character that does 1 damage can then finish them off? Or is it you have to break their defense to do any damage, and if you break their defense, they instantly die? And then if it's not that kind of situation, if they do accumulate damage, then what happens to that damage? Does it disappear at the end of the turn? Does it stick around? And then we're going to have to be managing a bunch of tokens or dice. Then, these are different situations that's going to change the overall feel and flow of the game, as well as what's good and what's not. So, some other things that are in consideration is the objective. We don't know how we win this game. So, in most games, it's pretty simple. Your opponent has a certain amount of health, you have a certain amount of health. The player that has no health fastest loses. Um, there are also generally some other win conditions. There are certain cards that could have their own win conditions, as well as generally decking is a win condition in a lot of games, although some have different mechanics for how that works, or it might not be a win condition at all. So in Lorcana, the only information we have about this is that from this tweet here, from someone that attended Spiel 2022, and it says that, Disney Lorcana, you're gathering a group of characters, starting quests, and earning lore. Now, earning lore sounds like a win condition for a game. Generally, you would think that would be the win condition for a board game, but Ravensburger, the people that are making Lorcana, are board game designers. So they may have brought in some of that board game concept into the card game. Now, what this means, nobody really knows. But it could be interesting if the little symbols down here are in fact lore, because and how that interacts with things. Now, if it's something along the lines of you're generating lore off of your characters in order to win, that creates a certain dynamic. If there's also a situation where if your opponent defeats a character or banishes it or whatever, they earn lore in a sort of bounty system, that could be a whole different situation as well, because then when you're building your deck, you have to balance out your bounties. So a card might be really good, but if it's worth a lot of lore and your opponent can easily kill it or can deal with it, then it might not be worth taking in your deck, because it would be advancing your opponent's game plan more than yours. And that would be something to consider when you're going out around building your decks. So we don't know how this quest or this lore mechanic works. It could be something along the lines of like secondaries, objectives in war games, where you pick some secondaries that are going to align with whatever your army wants to do. Or in this case, you would pick quests that align with whatever your deck wants to do. So if you're playing a hyper aggro red deck, a ruby deck, that just wants to keep swinging and kill stuff, then that could be, your quest might be you gain lore whenever you destroy another character or you gain that bounty. Whereas other decks with other quests might not gain bounties. So these are all situations, and this could be earning lore could be a secondary win condition. Like there could still be the situation of both players have health, and whoever gets to 0 health first loses. Now, in that case, it could be a situation of you're balancing your quests versus your aggro. And so You might end up having aggro quest decks who are just trying to do their thing and get to, whatever the win condition for their quests is as quickly as possible. And it's up to the opponent to stop them. And there could be aggro hate decks where their goal is to kill the opponent as quickly as possible. And then you have your mid ranges and your controls, and they would fall into this, interesting situation where you're managing not only your player's health, but also this other win condition resource. It could be, pretty deep, but we don't know how it's going to shape out. If it's more or less, you're attempting to accomplish your goals and get your quests, and your opponent's attempting to accomplish theirs, and your goal is primarily only interacting with your opponent in order to prevent them from, achieving their quests. Well, then that's a different game than, some of the other situations that we've described. So overall, there's just a lot we don't know about how the game is going to play and how it's going to shape out, which is exciting because we get to see how this all builds over time as new cards come out, as new information drops, revealing these things, pulling back the curtain, helping us see the shape of the game and how it's going to play. We can start putting all these pieces together and start, building the puzzle that is Lorcana as it stands right now, which is awesome. On top of that, beyond all the gameplay side of things, it's a card game. So there is a collection aspect of it. In order to play the cards, you need to own the cards. Generally, I mean, you can let your buddy, proxy some stuff, and that's fine. Play the game how you want to play, but in tourneys and things of that nature, generally you need to own the card to play the card. So, how hard is it going to be to collect these cards to build your decks? We don't know. We don't know what card rarities are going to look like. For example, in some card games, you can build a super competitive deck for practically nothing. Digimon's a good example. I believe Pokemon falls into this category where, the primary, the money cards, the ones that are difficult to get, and the ones that are expensive, and the ones people are searching for are alternate art or alternate treatment version of the cards. And so the cards that you're actually playing on the board aren't that difficult to find or aren't that expensive on the secondary market because they're not super rare. And so you're able to build your decks pretty cheaply. Other games, on the other hand, looking at Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood, and to some degrees Magic, is your good cards are going to be rare and are going to be hard to find and are going to be expensive, and your bad cards are going to be worth pennies. And so those decks, can go upwards of thousands of dollars. I saw something the other day about someone's $10,000 commander deck got ruined in the rain, which, like, oof, for one, but also, what? $10,000 for a deck of cards? Like, that's crazy, y'all. So hopefully, Lorcana goes the direction of, the Digimon or the Pokemon, I think, side of things, where they're going to be alternate art cards or something of that nature that makes their building your deck approachable. Universus is interesting. For the most part, it's fairly cheap to build a deck. I'm talking the My Hero card game. I'm not familiar with Universus before, back when it was Universal Fighting System or whatever it was. Where there's like your secret rares where you're only getting one in, I think it's 2 cases. No, it's like one per case. Yeah, and it's getting extra secret rares that are like one every 3 or 4 cases or something like that. And so, other than those secret rares, which are very specific and only certain decks actually need. Um, it's pretty easy to collect, everything. Two cases will get you a full playset of literally everything, which is still, a fair amount, but you also have cards that you can sell and things of that nature. So overall, this is going to be a big factor as well, is what's it going to cost to build decks? Now, assuming that this card game is um, marketed slightly towards children, and uh, Ravensburger has stated that they're building the game to play, not to collect, then hopefully the cards are accessible, decks are cheap, because I like playing a lot of different decks. Personally, I like being able to pick my flavor of the day, or flavor of the month, or flavor of the match. So, but if it's not, then that's a whole different consideration, because then that's going to be a barrier to entry. That's going to change, who's going to be playing the game, how many people are going to be playing the game, etc., etc. So, this is another major consideration that we have for the game, how it's going to work, and where it's going to go from here. So yeah, these are just some of my thoughts about what we don't know so far. Some things that are going to impact the game. If you have any ideas about things that could impact the game further that I haven't mentioned, or that you're really excited to find out about the game, please let me know in the comments. I would love to have that discussion with y'all. And, if enough good points get brought up, then maybe I'll make another video and talk about those, because I don't know everything. Absolutely not. And there could definitely be a bunch of things that I forgot to mention. But that's going to be it for today. So until next time, keep your ink pots full and your glimmers shiny.